start the final session of this conference. If I may take 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning. So I want to join others in saying what one of the most valuable experiences of my life was when Barney invited me to be a member of the North-South Round. I mainly took part in the Money and Finance Roundtables, which part in the first half of the 1980s, in which we mainly occupied with the debt crisis. It was the big issue of the time in that field. It certainly I benefited enormously in 2 different ways. First of all, from the formal sessions, where we discussed mainly debt. I think the first paper I gave was called Financial Intermediation Beyond the Debt Crisis, and was delivered in, was it in Istanbul in 1983, 84 at the latest. And perhaps the title was a little premature. The debt crisis, unfortunately, continued a little after that, but it was in fact a first draft of a publication which I did in 1985. The major theme of that was that one really ought not to rely on future financial intermediation to what are now known as emerging markets being done by the banks. But the banks were essentially unreliable suppliers, and instead of that one ought to look for other mechanisms. And one of the particular ones that I focused on was through the equity markets. It was with that end in view, preaching this gospel that I think in retrospect was the most unsuccessful mission of my life, to Oslo in December 1985, where I was telling them that they should invest their oil surplus in the form of equities in emerging markets. Well, I say it was unsuccessful because their oil surplus disappeared about a month later when the oil price fell out of bed, and it was about 10 years before they re-emerged as a significant surplus which had this option of investing. But I do remember that in the course of that mission I went to a party in Oslo, and I heard a Norwegian diplomat explaining that he'd been to, I don't know if it was the UN or the other meetings, and heard, of all people, a Pakistani complaining about the amount of military spending in developing countries. And I thought, oops, that sounds like Maghreb. I suspect that was right. We now think of this as the Latin American debt crisis, but in the early years it didn't seem to us like the Latin American crisis at all. It seemed like a fully crisis. Certainly the Philippines was, later it was called an honorary Latin American country, but it was a part of the debt crisis, all right. Korea, initially, there was a big fear that it was going to be sucked under, and then it emerged. So it wasn't until, I suspect, sometime in the late 80s that I realized just what an important distinction there was between the countries to the west of Pakistan, which I'd been accustomed to thinking of as typical developed countries, the Latin American countries, to some extent the African countries. I remember Helena correcting me very forcefully when I said that there wasn't a crisis in Latin America, in Africa, because they owed money to development agencies rather than commercial markets, and he said, oops, think again, and the figures I concluded he was right. But it was later in the 80s that I realized just how powerful this distinction was between countries to the west of Pakistan and those to the east. And once again, it was Mahbub that brought this home to me when he said, the 80s, he said, that's a bad decade if you lived west of Pakistan, but anywhere to the east it looks like an awfully good decade. This was a decade in which we grew much more than we had done before, in which 2/3 of the people of the developing world, in fact, did much better after the debt crisis broke out than in the beginning, and the same is true of the MDGs nowadays. We are all confident that they're going to be met in Asia and therefore in the world as a whole, or at least most of them, where mostly quite all not going to be met in all the other developing countries, certainly in Africa. The other great benefit of the North-South Round Table was in the informal acquaintances that one made. And I already knew Mahbub and Bani Haq before the North-South Round Table. So for me, the great, and I never did know Barbara Ward, so for me the great benefit of that was in meeting Jim Grant. And I want to recall an interview that I had with Jim Grant a matter of weeks before his death, in which he told me that he had in fact been instrumental in the negotiations between the United States and Taiwan, which initiated the East Asian, the miracle of the East Asian links. Remember, Taiwan was the first of the countries to change course, and it changed course essentially on the basis of a 14-point reform program. And that was a program which said essentially that yes, role for import substitution in the initial phase of industrialization, but it comes to an end very quickly, that after the first phase, initial import substitution, it makes sense to export the proceeds of that initial industrialization rather than push on and build a steel mill, which may have a big economic 20 years later, but in the interim its present value is strongly negative. And so, if I may take an example, this was a push towards marketization, in other words, towards recognizing the role that a useful role that a market could play. And that was to me reassuring because of the fact that this was one of the pillars of what was called the Washington Consensus. Please understand, this means something quite different by the term, and I too think that's a very bad strategy, and I don't want to endorse that, but what I initially laid out I think still makes a lot of sense, and I was reassured in that to find that Jim Grant had been one of the people who pioneered that type of thinking in the developing world and thereby helped lay the basis for the East Asian miracle. Let me then move on to the panel that we have this afternoon, and first of all I want to introduce Caroline McCaskey, who is currently with the United Nations as an Assistant Secretary General in charge of peace building, and she's going to talk about peacekeeping in the United Nations. Peace building, I'm sorry. She, in her past career, she has, among other claims to fame, she's visited IDF and stuff. She's headed CEDA. She's been the Canadian ambassador to Sri Lanka. She's worked on various humanitarian causes.